In the depths of World War II's Eastern Front, where mechanized armies clashed with unprecedented fury and modern fighters ruled the skies, an unlikely legend was born from the cockpit of the world's most underestimated aircraft. The story begins not with gleaming steel and roaring engines, but with wood, canvas, and the quiet determination of women who would transform military aviation forever. This is the tale of how the obsolete Polikarpov U-2 training plane became the terror of Nazi Germany, a weapon so primitive it was invisible to radar, so slow it couldn't be shot down, and so quiet it earned its pilots the haunting nickname, Night Witches. The year was 1941, and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of annihilation. German forces had swept across the border with devastating efficiency, their Blitzkrieg tactics crushing resistance and racing toward Moscow. In this desperate hour, when every resource was being mobilized for the defense of the motherland, an extraordinary decision was made that would defy every convention of modern warfare. The Soviet High Command authorized the formation of 3 all-female air regiments, and one of them, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, would be equipped with perhaps the most unlikely weapon of war, a collection of dusty, obsolete training planes that most military strategists had already written off as worthless. The Polikarpov U-2, later redesignated as the PO-2 in honor of its designer Nikolai Polikarpov, was never intended for combat. Born in 1927 from the drawing boards of the Soviet aviation industry, it was designed as a simple, reliable trainer aircraft, a flying classroom where novice pilots would learn the basics of aviation before graduating to more sophisticated machines. With its open cockpits, fabric-covered wings, and a modest 5-cylinder radial engine producing just 100 horsepower, the U-2 was the aviation equivalent of a horse and buggy in an age of motor cars. The aircraft's specifications told the story of its humble origins. A maximum speed of barely 152 kilometers per hour, a service ceiling of only 3,000 meters, and a range of 630 kilometers. Its wingspan stretched 11.4 meters, supporting a fabric-covered frame that weighed just 770 kilograms empty. The cockpit was open to the elements, offering no protection from wind, cold, or enemy fire. There was no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no sophisticated navigation equipment, just the bare essentials needed to keep a training aircraft aloft. In the pre-war years, the U-2 had served faithfully in its intended role, training thousands of Soviet pilots in the fundamentals of flight. It was used for crop dusting, mail delivery, and aerial photography, peaceful pursuits that seemed a world away from the mechanized warfare that was about to engulf Europe. The aircraft earned the affectionate nickname Kukuruznik among Soviet aviators, meaning corn cutter, a reference both to its agricultural applications and to the distinctive sound of its engine, which reminded many of farm machinery. But when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union found itself facing an existential crisis. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies with modern fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and bombers like the Heinkel He-111. Soviet air forces, caught off guard and poorly positioned, suffered catastrophic losses in the opening weeks of the war. Entire squadrons were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. The need for pilots, aircraft, and innovative tactics became desperate. It was in this context of desperation and innovation that Marina Raskova, a legendary Soviet aviator and navigator, proposed something unprecedented: the creation of all-female combat aviation regiments. Raskova, known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart, had been receiving thousands of letters from women across the Soviet Union, begging for the chance to serve their country as military pilots. The idea was revolutionary. No nation had ever before organized women into frontline combat aviation units. Stalin himself approved the formation of 3 female air regiments: the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. It was this last unit that would become legendary as the Night Witches. But there was a catch. While the other 2 regiments would eventually receive modern aircraft, the 588th would have to make do with whatever was available. What was available, in sufficient quantities and with minimal training requirements, was the humble U-2. The decision to equip a combat unit with training aircraft might have seemed like a cruel joke, but it contained the seeds of tactical brilliance. The U-2's very limitations would become its greatest strengths in the unique warfare of the Eastern Front. The aircraft was constructed primarily of wood and fabric, materials that were nearly invisible to the primitive radar systems of the early 1940s. Its small size and minimal metal content meant that German radar operators often dismissed U-2 signatures as birds or atmospheric interference. Even more importantly, the U-2's laughably slow maximum speed would prove to be a decisive advantage in aerial combat. German fighters like the Bf-109 had a stall speed higher than the U-2's cruising speed. This meant that if a German pilot tried to slow down enough to engage a U-2 effectively, his own aircraft would stall and potentially crash. The fastest fighters of the Luftwaffe were simply too advanced to effectively engage the most primitive aircraft still flying combat missions. The women selected for the 588th Night Bomber Regiment came from diverse backgrounds across the Soviet Union. Many were members of flying clubs. Others had experience as instructors or crop dusters. Some were university students, teachers, or engineers who had learned to fly as a hobby. What united them was an absolute determination to serve their country and a willingness to master an aircraft that offered little protection and even less comfort. Training for the Night Witches was conducted under conditions that would have broken lesser spirits. The women had to master not only the technical aspects of flying the U-2, but also the complex art of night navigation, using only basic instruments. They learned to read the landscape in darkness, to navigate by stars and landmarks, and to estimate distances and altitudes without the sophisticated equipment that other aircrews took for granted. The open cockpits meant they would be exposed to temperatures that could drop to -40°C during winter missions. The tactical doctrine developed for the Night Witches was unlike anything else in aviation history. The aircraft would operate exclusively at night, taking advantage of darkness to approach German positions undetected. The standard loadout for a combat mission was modest by any measure: 2 50-kilogram bombs suspended beneath the lower wings, along with occasionally some small incendiary devices or propaganda leaflets. But the real innovation lay in how these seemingly inadequate weapons were employed. The Night Witches developed a technique that would become their signature: the silent approach. As they neared their target, the pilot would cut the engine and glide toward the target area. The only sound would be the whisper of wind through the aircraft's rigging wires, a sound so faint and otherworldly that German soldiers began to associate it with supernatural forces. The psychological effect of these attacks was far greater than their physical damage might suggest. German troops, already exhausted by months of brutal fighting, found themselves subjected to random attacks throughout the night. The bombs themselves might destroy a supply depot, damage a bridge, or kill a few soldiers, but the true impact was on morale. The inability to predict when or where the next attack might come created a constant state of anxiety that wore down German effectiveness. German soldiers began calling the U-2 pilots Nachthexen, Night Witches, a name that spoke to both their effectiveness and the supernatural dread they inspired. The sound of the aircraft's approach, that eerie whistling of wind through wire bracing, became known as the sewing machine sound, and it could send entire units scrambling for cover. German anti-aircraft gunners fired thousands of rounds into the darkness, often at phantoms, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions to other Soviet forces. The individual stories of the Night Witches read like epic literature. There was Nadezhda Popova, who flew 852 combat missions and once landed her aircraft with 42 bullet holes in the wings and fuselage, calmly reporting to her ground crew that the plane needed a little patching up before the next sortie. Yekaterina Ryabova and her navigator Nadezhda Studilina flew together for 2 years, developing an almost telepathic understanding that allowed them to execute perfect attacks in total darkness. Perhaps most remarkable was Lydia Litviak. Though she served in the fighter regiment, her story exemplifies the courage of all the female aviators. These women faced not only the dangers of combat, but also skepticism and sometimes outright hostility from their male counterparts. They had to prove themselves night after night, mission after mission, demonstrating that skill and courage were not limited by gender. The technical challenges faced by the Night Witches were immense. The U-2's instruments were basic even by 1941 standards. Navigation was accomplished with a compass, a map, a flashlight, and dead reckoning. Communication between aircraft was impossible. There were no radios. Each crew had to operate independently, making split-second decisions based on their training and instincts. The aircraft's open cockpits became torture chambers during winter operations. Pilots and navigators wore every piece of warm clothing they could find, But frostbite was a constant threat. Many missions were flown with crews whose faces were numb with cold, their hands barely able to grip the controls. Ice would form on the aircraft's control surfaces, affecting handling, while the crew struggled to maintain focus despite physical discomfort that would have been unbearable to most people. Maintenance of the aircraft under field conditions was another monumental challenge. The Night Witches often had to service their own planes, patching bullet holes, replacing damaged cables, and performing engine maintenance with minimal tools and spare parts. The simplicity of the U-2's design became a blessing in this regard. There were fewer complex systems to fail, and repairs could often be improvised with materials at hand. The bomb load, though small by the standards of heavy bombers, was used with surgical precision. The Night Witches became masters of target selection, focusing on high-value objectives where even small bombs could have disproportionate effects. Fuel dumps, ammunition storage areas, communication centers, and command posts were favored targets. A well-placed 50-kilogram bomb could destroy supplies worth thousands of times its own weight, or disrupt communications for an entire sector. The tactics evolved throughout the war as both sides adapted to new realities. The Night Witches began operating in formations of 3 aircraft, with 2 acting as decoys to draw anti-aircraft fire and searchlights, while the third made the actual attack run. This required extraordinary coordination and mutual trust, as the decoy pilots were deliberately making themselves targets to ensure the success of the mission. As the war progressed, German forces developed countermeasures specifically designed to combat the Night Witches. Additional searchlights were deployed, anti-aircraft gun positions were reinforced, and night fighters were allocated to patrol areas known to be targeted by the U-2s. The Germans even developed a specialized night fighter variant of the Bf-109 specifically intended to hunt the slow-flying Soviet aircraft. But for every countermeasure the Germans deployed, the Night Witches developed new techniques. They learned to vary their approach routes, timing, and altitudes to remain unpredictable. They began coordinating their attacks with larger Soviet operations, using their unique capabilities to support major offensives by disrupting German rear areas, precisely when conventional forces needed the advantage. The physical toll on the air crews was severe. Many Night Witches flew multiple missions per night, sometimes as many as 15 or 20 sorties in a single evening. The constant stress of combat, combined with sleep deprivation and the physical demands of flying an open cockpit aircraft in all weather conditions, pushed human endurance to its limits. Yet they continued, night after night, because they understood that their unique contribution to the war effort could not be replicated by any other type of unit. The recognition of their effectiveness came not only from their own high command, but from their enemies as well. German intelligence documents from the period reveal a grudging respect for the Night Witches' tactical innovation and persistent effectiveness. Some German units requested transfers away from sectors where the Night Witches were known to operate, and German propaganda began portraying the Soviet female pilots as evidence of the USSR's desperate situation, a narrative that ironically served to highlight their impact. The total operational statistics of the Night Witches are staggering by any measure. Over the course of the war, they flew more than 23,000 combat sorties, dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs, and caused immeasurable disruption to German rear areas. Individual pilots accumulated mission counts that exceeded those of many conventional bomber crews, with some Night Witches completing over 1,000 combat flights. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Night Witches' contribution was how they changed military aviation doctrine forever. Their success proved that innovation and adaptability could overcome technological disadvantage, that unconventional tactics could be more effective than conventional ones, and that the human element remained paramount in warfare regardless of technological advancement. The U-2 aircraft itself became a legend in its own right. What had begun as a humble trainer, dismissed by aviation experts as obsolete, had been transformed into one of the war's most effective psychological weapons. The aircraft's very primitiveness became its greatest strength, demonstrating that in warfare, apparent weaknesses could be turned into decisive advantages through creative thinking and tactical innovation. The legacy of the Night Witches extends far beyond their immediate military accomplishments. They proved that gender was no barrier to combat effectiveness, paving the way for women's participation in military aviation worldwide. They demonstrated that small, seemingly insignificant actions could have strategic impact when applied consistently and intelligently. Most importantly, they showed that human courage and ingenuity could triumph over superior technology and resources. As the war drew to a close, many night witches had been decorated with the Soviet Union's highest honors. 23 members of the regiment received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the nation's equivalent of the Medal of Honor. But for most of them, the greatest reward was simply knowing they had served their country effectively when it needed them most. The post-war years saw the night witches gradually fade from public consciousness as the world moved on to new conflicts and new technologies. The U-2 aircraft continued in service for many years after the war, returning to its original roles as trainer and utility aircraft. But those who knew the full story understood that this humble machine had played a role in history far beyond anything its designers had ever imagined. Today, as we look back at the story of the night witches and their obsolete training planes, we see more than just a fascinating chapter of military history. We see a powerful reminder that innovation often comes not from having the best equipment, but from making the most creative use of what is available. The night witches proved that limitation can inspire innovation, that weakness can be transformed into strength, and that the human spirit, when properly directed, can overcome any technological disadvantage. The lesson resonates beyond military applications. In business, in science, in any field of human endeavor. The story of the night witches reminds us that breakthrough success often comes not from having unlimited resources, but from seeing possibilities where others see only obstacles. The U-2 was slow, primitive, and vulnerable, but in the hands of skilled and determined pilots, it became a weapon that struck fear into the heart of one of history's most powerful military forces. The night witches flew their last combat missions as Soviet forces advanced into Germany itself. By then, the humble U-2 had earned its place in aviation history alongside the most celebrated fighters and bombers of the war. It had proven that in the right circumstances, with the right tactics and the right people, even the most unlikely tools could achieve extraordinary results. The transformation of the U-2 from training aircraft to terror weapon represents one of warfare's most remarkable reinventions. It stands as proof that military success depends not just on having superior technology, but on the wisdom to use whatever tools are available in ways that maximize their unique advantages, while minimizing their inherent limitations. In the end, the legacy of the night witches and their obsolete aircraft transcends their specific historical moment. Their story continues to inspire aviators, military strategists, and anyone who faces seemingly impossible odds with limited resources. They proved that determination, creativity, and tactical brilliance could transform the most humble beginnings into legendary achievements. A lesson as relevant today as it was in the dark skies over the Eastern Front more than 8 decades ago. The transformation of the obsolete U-2 into a weapon of war required not just tactical innovation, but also extraordinary human adaptation. The pilots and navigators of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had to learn to operate in conditions that would have been considered impossible by conventional military standards. Their training regimen reflected this reality, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible in aviation. The formation of the regiment began in October 1941, when Stalin approved Marina Raskova's proposal for all-female combat aviation units. Raskova, already a celebrated figure in Soviet aviation, had set numerous records and understood both the capabilities of women pilots and the desperate need for every available combat asset as German forces advanced toward Moscow. The recruits came from across the Soviet Union, responding to Raskova's call with overwhelming enthusiasm. Over 2,000 women volunteered, though only a fraction could be accepted into the 3 regiments being formed. The selection process was rigorous despite the urgency of wartime conditions. The women had to demonstrate not only flying ability, but also physical endurance, mental toughness, and the capacity to function under extreme stress. Many of the volunteers were already experienced pilots, having learned to fly through Soviet flying clubs, or as crop dusting pilots. Others had worked as aviation mechanics, parachute riggers, or in other aviation-related roles. Their ages ranged from late teens to mid-20s, though a few older, more experienced aviators also joined. Training took place at Engels, a military airfield near Saratov on the Volga River. The conditions were Spartan, even by wartime standards. The women were issued men's uniforms, which often had to be altered to fit properly. They wore boots that were frequently too large, requiring them to stuff them with newspaper or cloth to make them wearable. The physical training was intense, designed to prepare them for the demands of combat flying in open cockpit aircraft at high altitude in all weather conditions. The technical training focused on mastering the U-2 in conditions far beyond its original design parameters. Student pilots had to learn to fly at night, using minimal instruments and relying heavily on visual navigation and dead reckoning. They practiced navigation using only maps, compasses, stopwatches, and flashlights, tools that would become their primary equipment throughout the war. Radio communication was not part of their training because the aircraft they would fly had no radios. The navigators, who also served as bombardiers, faced their own unique challenges. They had to master the art of calculating bomb trajectories from a moving, often buffeted aircraft, taking into account wind speed, altitude, and the aircraft's velocity. They learned to use rudimentary bomb sights and, when those failed or proved inadequate, to rely on practiced judgment and intuition. The navigator's role was made more complex by the need to also manage the aircraft's defensive posture, watching for searchlights and tracer fire while directing the pilot through evasive maneuvers. One of the most difficult aspects of training was learning to operate as part of a coordinated attack formation. The three-aircraft tactic that would become the Night Witch's signature required precise timing, absolute trust between crews, and the ability to maintain formation in darkness without radio communication. Pilots had to learn to judge distances and positions visually, relying on brief glimpses of other aircraft against the night sky or the glow of their engines. The first combat deployment came in June 1942, when the regiment was assigned to the southern front near the Caucasus. The circumstances of their arrival at the front were inauspicious. Male pilots and ground crew at the airfield where they were based initially regarded them with skepticism bordering on contempt. Some male aviators openly mocked the idea of women flying combat missions, and there were attempts to have the regiment reassigned to non-combat duties. The women of the 588th would have to prove themselves through performance, and the proof would have to be overwhelming. The first mission, launched on June 8, 1942, targeted a German division headquarters. 3 aircraft participated in the initial raid. The attack was successful, achieving surprise and causing significant disruption to German command and control operations. However, 1 aircraft was lost, a sobering reminder of the dangers they faced. The loss could have been demoralizing, but instead, it hardened the resolve of the surviving crews. They understood that their comrades' sacrifice had to be honored through continued success. From that first mission onward, the Night Witches established a pattern of operations that would continue for the remainder of the war. They flew exclusively at night, taking off at dusk and continuing operations until dawn. A typical night's work involved between 8 and 18 sorties per crew, each lasting 30 to 50 minutes. The pace was relentless, driven by both military necessity and the limitations of their aircraft. Since each U-2 could carry only 2 bombs, multiple missions were required to deliver a militarily significant payload. The logistics of sustaining this operational tempo were staggering. Between sorties, the aircraft had to be refueled, rearmed, and inspected for damage. Any mechanical issues had to be addressed immediately to ensure the aircraft would be ready for the next mission. The ground crews, also composed entirely of women from the regiment, worked with the same intensity as the flight crews. They manhandled bombs into position, wrestled fuel drums, patched bullet holes, and replaced damaged components, often working in darkness with minimal equipment. The physical toll on the air crews accumulated mission by mission. The open cockpits exposed them to wind chill that could reach life-threatening levels during winter operations. Pilots reported cases where their hands became so numb they could barely feel the control stick, relying on muscle memory and visual cues to maintain control of the aircraft. Frostbite was common, and many Night Witches bore the scars of it for the rest of their lives. In one particularly brutal winter mission, a pilot's face became so frozen that she couldn't speak after landing, communicating through hand signals until she could be warmed enough to regain speech. The danger wasn't limited to combat and weather. The very act of flying the U-2 at night, in close proximity to other aircraft, with no radio communication and minimal lighting, created constant risk of collision. Pilots had to maintain awareness of the positions of other friendly aircraft while simultaneously navigating, watching for enemy defenses, and preparing for their attack run. The cognitive load was immense, and mistakes could be instantly fatal. The German response to the Night Witches evolved as their effectiveness became apparent. Initially, German forces had been confused and disorganized when faced with these nocturnal raids. The sound of the approaching aircraft was unlike anything they had encountered, too quiet for bombers, too persistent for reconnaissance. Early attempts to shoot them down with standard anti-aircraft tactics proved frustratingly ineffective. The aircraft were too small, too maneuverable, and too unpredictable in their approach patterns. As the war progressed, German forces began to develop specialized countermeasures. Searchlight batteries were reinforced and repositioned to create overlapping coverage zones that were harder to penetrate undetected. Anti-aircraft gun crews were trained specifically in engaging slow-moving, low-altitude targets. Night fighters were allocated to patrol sectors known to be targeted by the night witches, though with limited success given the speed differential between the fighter aircraft and the U-2s. German intelligence officers studied the night witches' tactics, trying to predict their targets and flight patterns. They discovered that the Soviet pilots favored certain approach routes based on terrain features and prevailing winds. Defensive positions were adjusted accordingly, with additional guns placed along likely approach corridors. But the night witches adapted in turn, varying their tactics and constantly seeking new ways to exploit German defensive weaknesses. One particularly effective German countermeasure was the use of barrage balloons tethered with steel cables in areas likely to be attacked. The cables posed a deadly hazard to low-flying aircraft, and several U-2s were lost when they struck cables in darkness. The night witches responded by increasing their reconnaissance efforts, mapping the positions of balloon positions, and adjusting their flight paths accordingly. When balloon positions changed, spotters would note the changes and relay the information to flight crews before their next mission. The psychological dimensions of the Night Witches campaign became increasingly important as the war continued. German soldiers in sectors regularly targeted by the regiment experienced chronic sleep deprivation, as the threat of nocturnal bombing runs meant they had to remain at least partially alert throughout the night. This cumulative fatigue degraded combat effectiveness, slowed reaction times, and eroded morale. German after-action reports from the Eastern Front frequently mention the demoralizing effect of the persistent night raids. The name Nachthexen itself reveals the psychological impact of these attacks. By invoking supernatural imagery, the German soldiers were unconsciously acknowledging that they felt helpless against an enemy they couldn't effectively counter. The comparison to witches flying through the night on broomsticks captured both the eerie sound of the approaching aircraft and the sense of uncanny threat they represented. The night witches themselves embraced the name, recognizing it as a measure of their effectiveness. Individual night witches became legendary for their exploits. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most decorated pilots, flew 852 combat missions over the course of the war, more sorties than most bomber pilots in any air force accumulated in entire careers. Her aircraft was shot down multiple times, and she sustained injuries that would have ended most pilots' careers, but she always returned to flying. On one occasion, her aircraft was so badly damaged by anti-aircraft fire that 42 bullet holes were counted in the wings and fuselage, with additional hits to her helmet and maps. She landed the aircraft, had it repaired, and flew again that same night. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who commanded the regiment throughout the war, became known for her leadership style that balanced military discipline with genuine care for her pilots. She understood that the psychological pressure of their mission required strong emotional support as well as tactical guidance. Under her command, the regiment developed a culture of mutual support and collective responsibility that sustained them through the darkest periods of the war. Her ability to maintain unit cohesion and effectiveness earned her the respect of both her subordinates and the male commanders with whom she worked. The tactical evolution of the Night Witches continued throughout the war as they encountered new situations and challenges. During the Battle of the Caucasus from 1942 to 1943, they flew 2,920 sorties in support of Soviet ground forces, fighting to prevent German forces from reaching the oil fields of Baku. The mountainous terrain of the Caucasus presented unique challenges for navigation and target identification, but also provided opportunities for using terrain masking to approach targets more safely. The Kuban, Taman, and Novorossiysk campaigns saw the Night Witches fly 4,623 sorties in some of the most intensive operations of their war. These battles involved coordinated assaults on heavily defended German positions, requiring precision bombing of specific targets to support advancing Soviet forces. The regiment proved they could perform tactical support missions with accuracy comparable to much more sophisticated aircraft. During the Crimean Offensive of 1944, the Night Witches flew an astounding 6,140 sorties, their highest total for any single campaign. The liberation of Crimea was a major strategic objective for Soviet forces, and the Night Witches played a crucial role in disrupting German defensive preparations and supply lines. Their attacks on transportation infrastructure, bridges, rail lines, and supply depots directly contributed to the success of the ground offensive. As Soviet forces advanced westward in 1944 and 1945, the Night Witches participated in operations across Belarus, Poland, and finally into Germany itself. The Poland offensive saw them fly 5,421 sorties, supporting the massive Soviet push toward Berlin. By this stage of the war, they were operating over increasingly hostile territory, with German air defenses at their most desperate and dangerous. Yet the losses remained relatively low, testament to the effectiveness of their tactics and the skill of the pilots. The final phase of operations, designated simply as the German offensive in Soviet records, involved approximately 2,000 sorties as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. The Night Witches continued flying combat missions until the last days of the war, their final sorties flown in support of troops fighting in the ruins of German cities. When the war ended in May 1945, many Night Witches had been flying combat missions continuously for nearly 3 years. The statistical record of the Night Witches' wartime service is remarkable by any measure. The regiment flew approximately 23,672 combat sorties over the course of the war, collectively, logging 28,676 flight hours, equivalent to more than 3 years of continuous flight. They dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs and over 26,000 incendiary shells on German positions, infrastructure, and troop concentrations. The targets they destroyed or damaged tell the story of a comprehensive campaign against German military capabilities. 17 river crossings, denying German forces vital mobility. 9 railway lines, disrupting supply and reinforcement. 2 railway stations, creating logistical bottlenecks. 26 warehouses, destroying stockpiled supplies. 12 fuel depots, limiting German mechanized forces' operational range. 176 armored vehicles, directly reducing German combat power. 86 prepared firing positions, degrading German defensive capabilities. And 11 searchlights, reducing the effectiveness of German air defenses. Beyond their offensive operations, the Night Witches also flew 155 supply missions, delivering food and ammunition to Soviet forces that had been cut off, or were operating in difficult terrain. These supply drops required different skills than bombing runs. The supplies had to be delivered accurately to small drop zones, often marked only by signal fires or flashlights, and the aircraft had to fly slowly and steadily during the drop, making them vulnerable to ground fire. The human cost of these operations, while lower than might have been expected given the dangerous nature of their missions, was still significant. Over the course of the war, 32 members of the regiment died from various causes including combat, accidents, and disease. 28 aircraft were written off as total losses, though many more sustained damage that required extensive repair. The relatively low casualty rate, given the number of sorties flown and the inherent dangers of the mission, speaks to both the effectiveness of their tactics and the exceptional skill of the pilots. The recognition the Night Witches received for their service was substantial, though it came slowly at first. Early in the war, when skepticism about female combat pilots was still widespread, their achievements were often downplayed or attributed to other factors. But as the evidence of their effectiveness became undeniable, official recognition followed. In February 1943, the regiment was awarded Guard status, becoming the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, a designation reserved for units that had demonstrated exceptional combat performance. This was accompanied by the Taman Honorific, recognizing their role in the Taman Peninsula operations. Individual awards were distributed throughout the war, with pilots and navigators receiving medals for specific acts of valor or for accumulating large numbers of successful missions. By war's end, 23 members of the regiment had received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the highest honor the nation could bestow. Among these were Nadezhda Popova, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, and many other pilots whose names became synonymous with courage and skill. The post-war fate of the Night Witches varied. Many continued in aviation, becoming test pilots, instructors, or commercial pilots in the rapidly expanding Soviet civil aviation industry. Others returned to civilian life, pursuing careers in education, engineering, and other fields. Some remained in the military, though opportunities for women in combat aviation diminished rapidly after the war, as demobilization returned military aviation to its pre-war male-dominated state. The U-2 aircraft itself enjoyed a long post-war career, though never again in the dramatic combat role it had played during the war. Production of the aircraft continued until 1952, with over 40,000 examples built, making it the most produced biplane in aviation history. It continued to serve in its original roles as trainer, utility aircraft, and agricultural plane throughout the Soviet Union and in many other countries. Some remained in service into the 1970s. Remarkable longevity for an aircraft design that originated in 1927. The legacy of the Night Witches extends far beyond their immediate military accomplishments. They demonstrated conclusively that women could perform effectively in combat aviation roles, paving the way for women's integration into military aviation forces worldwide. Though it would take decades for most nations to fully embrace this reality, the example of the Night Witches provided undeniable evidence that gender was not a limiting factor in aviation performance. Their tactical innovations influenced military doctrine in ways that extended beyond the specific circumstances of their operations. The principles they demonstrated, using stealth over speed, exploiting enemy weaknesses rather than engaging in direct confrontation, accepting technological disadvantage while maximizing tactical advantage, became part of the intellectual foundation for what would later be called asymmetric warfare. Modern special operations, forces, unmanned aerial vehicle tactics, and other contemporary military approaches owe something to the precedents established by the Night Witches. The story of the Night Witches and their obsolete aircraft resonates because it challenges fundamental assumptions about warfare and technology. In an era increasingly dominated by technological sophistication, where military advantage is often measured in terms of advanced sensors, precision weapons, and information systems, the Night Witches remind us that human factors, courage, creativity, adaptability, remain paramount. Their success proves that apparent technological inferiority can be overcome through superior tactics and unwavering determination. The transformation of the U-2 from forgotten training aircraft to legendary weapon of war stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of creative adaptation. What made this transformation possible was not any modification to the aircraft itself. The U-2s flown by the Night Witches were essentially identical to the trainers that had been produced for over a decade. The transformation occurred not in the machine, but in how it was employed, in the tactical doctrine developed around its unique characteristics, and in the exceptional skill of the women who flew it. This story carries lessons that transcend its specific historical context. In any field of endeavor, the Night Witches demonstrate the power of reframing limitations as opportunities. The U-2 was slow, but that slowness made it nearly impossible for enemy fighters to engage. It was primitive, but that primitiveness made it invisible to radar. It was lightly armed, but that lightness gave it maneuverability and the ability to operate from improvised airfields. Every weakness properly understood and tactically exploited became a strength. The Night Witches also exemplify the importance of organizational culture in achieving exceptional performance. The mutual support, collective responsibility, and shared determination that characterized the regiment created an environment where individuals could perform at levels that exceeded what would normally be expected. The ground crews worked with the same dedication as the flight crews, understanding that their contribution was essential to mission success. This unity of purpose, rare even in elite military units, helped the Night Witches sustain their extraordinary operational tempo throughout the war. As we reflect on the story of the Night Witches decades after the events, we see not just a fascinating chapter of military history, but a timeless lesson about human potential. They took the tools they were given, however inadequate they might have seemed, and transformed them into instruments of strategic impact. They faced discrimination, skepticism, and danger with unwavering resolve. They proved that excellence knows no gender, that innovation matters more than resources, and that determination can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The humble U-2, once dismissed as obsolete and useless for modern warfare, earned its place in history alongside the most celebrated aircraft ever built. The Night Witches, once doubted and dismissed, became legends whose story continues to inspire. Together, they stand as enduring proof that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the combination of human courage and tactical brilliance can achieve what advanced technology alone never could.